Have you ever had a day that started off like a peaceful painting and suddenly turned into an unscripted action movie? I was on my porch that morning, hot coffee in hand, steam curling lazily as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The silence was almost sacred, just the hoarse crow of a distant rooster and the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. My home, my refuge, a slice of land I earned with sweat and stubbornness, everything was perfect, until I heard the sound. That unmistakable crrrunch of tires chewing up the gravel road, cutting through my property. It wasn't the mailman, nor a lost neighbor asking for sugar. It was an army. A cloud of dust rose like smoke from a battlefield, and then they appeared. Shiny black SUVs gleaming like giant beetles, trailers rocking with the weight of who knows what, and a horde of over 80 people swarming in like hungry locusts. Colorful tents were already being set up, voices shouting orders, chaos settling in as if my land were a public amusement park. I blinked, my coffee cooling in my hand, trying to figure out if this was real or if I'd fallen into some bizarre nightmare, and then I saw her. In the middle of the mess, like a deranged general leading her troops, stood Susan Hayes, the self-proclaimed queen of Pinewood Estates, with her flawless blonde hair, designer sunglasses, and a clipboard she waved like a royal scepter. Her smile was sharp, the kind that says, "I run this place and you better fall in line." She marched straight up to the edge of my fence, her heels sinking into the dirt, barking orders to secure the perimeter. My property, my home. She thought she could just show up, plant an imaginary flag, and claim the land as hers, like I was some extra in her conquest story. But Susan didn't count on one thing, or rather 5 things. My pit bulls, Roxy, Tank, Diesel, Luna, and Brutus, were already on the porch with me, ears perked, muscles tensed, a low growl rumbling from their throats like distant thunder. They weren't Instagram pets with bows on their collars. They were my guardians, my first line of defense. And me? I wasn't the type to just stand by while someone trampled over what's mine. The coffee hit the ground, the mug cracking on the wood. I took a deep breath, feeling the blood pulse in my temples. If Susan wanted war, she was about to get it, and I was ready to fight dirty. It was like watching a circus set up in my living room. But not just any circus. One of those chaotic, small-town shows where the trapeze artist is half drunk and the lion looks more bored than fierce. People poured out of cars like clowns from a toy car, laughing loudly, their voices echoing off the walls and making my flower pots tremble in fear. They unloaded stuff like I'd not only rolled out the red carpet, but also lit up a neon sign flashing, "Free entry, help yourself." Old overstuffed suitcases exploded with broken zippers, spitting out wrinkled t-shirts and mismatched socks. Crooked boxes full of junk clinked like an off-key bell choir. Someone even tossed a blender without a lid onto the ground, like it was some kind of trophy. And the couch? A saggy monster, with torn upholstery and a spring sticking out like it was trying to escape the madness, probably rescued from a damp alley where even the rats had given up on it. I stood there, frozen, watching the invasion. A burly man in a plaid shirt that screamed retired lumberjack stomped past me carrying a cooler that dripped water, leaving a muddy trail across my floor. "Where's the bathroom, boss?" he grunted without even looking at me, his heavy boots crushing my rug like it was a battlefield. Another figure, a woman with wild hair and a smile that said, "I know I'm causing trouble," was juggling a pile of pots, one of which clanged to the floor with a deafening crash. She just laughed louder. It was a parade of absurdity, a caravan of noise and disorder turning my home into an impromptu stage. But I hadn't been invited to this party. I was its victim, the unpainted clown trying to make sense of how my life became the main act in a show I never bought a ticket to. Susan marched toward Jack like a general on a mission, the kind of person who walks into a room, assuming everyone will bow to her presence. Behind her were 2 assistants, stumbling over their own anxiety trying to keep up. Phil, a skinny, twitchy guy, kept adjusting his crooked glasses like they were about to fall off. Sweat shimmered on his forehead, and it was obvious he'd rather be anywhere else, maybe hiding behind a stack of papers in a dusty office. Diane, on the other hand, clutched her tablet like it was a medieval shield, her fingers tapping the screen with a desperate energy that said she was one click away from calling for backup, or at least Googling how to handle angry property owners. Susan stopped in front of Jack with a wide grin, the kind of practiced smile politicians use in campaign ads, and said, "Jack, it's so wonderful of you to let us use the land. The Pinewood Estates Committee voted unanimously. It's the perfect place for our retreat." Her voice had that sugary, sing-song tone, like she was handing out an award instead of dropping a bomb on him. Jack furrowed his brow, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet, not from emotion, but pure disbelief. "I'm not on the committee, Susan," he shot back, his voice firm like a slamming door. "I never signed anything, no one asked my permission, and this is my private property. What's going on here?" Susan didn't even blink. She ignored his reply like a buzzing mosquito and pulled a colorful flyer from her pocket, waving it in the air like a victory flag. "Look, Jack, we already have 87 sign-ups, scouts, a yoga group, even a crafting club. It's going to be amazing. You'll love seeing the community come together." She spoke fast, stacking words like pure enthusiasm could smother any objection. Phil opened his mouth, hesitant, raising a trembling finger. Susan, just a small detail. There's no signed land agreement and—" Before he could finish, Susan turned her head like a possessed owl and hissed, "Phil, shut up. Everything's under control." The poor guy shrank back, glasses sliding another inch down his nose, mumbling something about legal liability that no one heard. Diane, still glued to her tablet, cleared her throat and cautiously added, "Actually, Susan, I just confirmed. This land isn't even within Pinewood Estates' jurisdiction. It's outside the recorded limits." Her eyes jumped from the screen to Susan, bracing for an outburst. But Susan just waved her hand in the air like swatting a fly. "Diane, darling, stop being so technical. Jack should be proud to contribute to the neighborhood. Just imagine. Kids running around, yogis meditating at sunset. It's practically a gift from him to all of us." She smiled again, her teeth gleaming like they'd been polished just for that moment. Jack felt his blood rise, a heat that started in his chest and shot straight to his head. He looked at Susan, at that trio of intruders who seemed straight out of a bad comedy, and realized she wasn't going to back down with logic or reason. She was in her own world where no was just a misinterpreted yes. But Jack wasn't the type to swallow nonsense. While Susan kept babbling about bonfires and group chants, he was already picturing his pit bulls Brutus and Rex, charging out of the yard with bared teeth, their collars jingling like war bells. Let's see who wants to meditate with them. Around, he thought, a crooked smile starting to form at the corner of his mouth. If Susan wanted a circus, he'd make sure the lions were the stars. I tried to be reasonable, I swear I did. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and spoke with the calm tone of a civilized man, the kind who settles disputes over coffee and a handshake. "Susan, listen. This is my land, my place, my refuge. You can't just show up and set up a festival without even telling me." My voice was firm but polite, like I was explaining to a child that the sky is blue. But Susan, she didn't even lift her eyes from that imaginary clipboard that seemed to rule her universe. She kept talking about schedules, tents, and the positive energy of the retreat, as if I were just a minor inconvenience in her grand vision. Phil shuffled his feet behind her, clearly wishing he could disappear, while Diane typed on her tablet like she was sending out a silent SOS. I tried again, raising my voice just a notch, still holding it together. "Are you hearing me? There's no permission, no agreement, nothing. This isn't a public park." She finally looked at me, but with that condescending smile, like I was a puppy barking for attention. "Jack, relax," she said, waving her hand in the air like a queen dismissing a subject. "You'll see how good this will be for everyone. You just need to open your heart." Open my heart? I almost laughed, but the anger was already rising, like lava, hot and impossible to ignore. That's when I knew words weren't going to work. Susan didn't listen. She only saw her mental clipboard, her imagined power to turn my life into a stage for her delusions. It was like trying to negotiate with a hurricane or convince a runaway train to turn around. While she kept going on about community harmony, I was already in another zone. Brutus and Rex growling low, the sound of their paws on the ground, the panic in the eyes of the scouts and yogis when they realized the retreat had turned into a survival run. Words were useless. But my pit bulls, those she'd have to listen to. Jack planted his feet firmly, his voice coming out like a low, controlled thunder. "This land is mine, Susan. Registered in my family's name since 1968, earned with my grandfather's sweat and my father's calloused hands. No Pinewood Estates Committee has a shred of authority here, and you all know it." He pointed toward the horizon, where the wire fence still marked the boundaries his old man had proudly laid down, like he was sketching the argument in the air. But Susan wasn't moved. She raised her hand with a theatrical flourish, like a conductor, leading an invisible orchestra, and declared, "Then how about a vote? Let the campers decide. Who thinks the retreat should happen here?" Her tone was pure challenge, as if democracy could erase a deed and hand over his property on a silver platter. A few hands went up, hesitantly, among the curious onlookers, who had gathered, drawn in by the smell of trouble. Linda, a middle-aged woman in a ridiculous straw hat, raised both arms, nearly bouncing with excitement. "I think it's a wonderful idea. A community retreat. How beautiful." Greg, a scruffy bearded man with a nervous look, half raised his hand, casting a quick apologetic glance at Jack. Tom, leaning against a car with a beer in hand, mumbled something about just trying to avoid trouble while scratching his neck, clearly torn between choosing a side or just walking away. The rest of the group exchanged glances, some chuckling like it was a game, others frowning, as they felt the tension rising. Greg cleared his throat like he was about to cough up an important question. "Susan, hold on. Do we even have legal permission for this? My wife's at home freaking out over the noise and smoke, and if the cops show up, I don't want any trouble." His voice trembled a little, the kind of guy who could already picture handcuffs and fines. Susan whipped around to him, eyes blazing, pointing a finger like a dagger. "Greg, be quiet. Stop making drama. This is for a greater cause." Then, she turned back to Jack, her smile gone, replaced with a scowl. "You're selfish, Jack. Always have been. You're ruining an event meant to bring the community together, all because of your pride." Phil, still fidgeting with his glasses, like they were a talisman against chaos, took a timid step forward. "Susan, I think Jack means it. Maybe we should call the committee's lawyer, double-check the paperwork." Before he could finish, Susan clapped her hands sharply, slicing the air. "Phil, stop interfering. Count the votes, now." He shrank back, grabbing a notepad with trembling hands, while Diane beside him typed on her tablet like she was documenting the end of the world. Jack shook his head, his patience draining like water from a leaky bucket. "I didn't sign anything, I didn't vote on anything, and I'm not letting my land become Pinewood Estates Circus. You can stage all the votes you want. This land isn't yours." His voice struck like a hammer on hot iron, each word landing with weight. Susan rolled her eyes, crossing her arms with a dramatic sigh. "Jack, you've always been like this. A loner. You skip neighborhood meetings, you never help the neighbors. I don't even know why we still try to include you." Her tone was the kind that hurled guilt like a grenade, hoping it would explode in his conscience. But Jack didn't explode, he hardened. He placed his coffee cup on the porch railing with a sharp click, the sound slicing through the chatter like a knife. He crossed his arms, muscles tense beneath his worn-out shirt, and stared at Susan with a look that said more than any speech. Enough talk. He let out a low whistle, a short, sharp sound that echoed across the yard, and the deep barks of Brutus, and Rex answered like thunder rolling in. The pit bulls appeared from the corner of the house, ears perked, eyes locked, collars jingling like bells from a two-dog army. The crowd froze. Linda dropped her hat, Greg took a step back, and even Susan hesitated, her smile faltering for the first time. Jack didn't say a word, but the message was crystal clear. No committee ruled here, he did, and his dogs were ready to prove it. Susan thought she could bend me with votes and speeches, like I was some dry twig she could snap with a smile. And a clipboard. But I've got 5 aces up my sleeve. Roxy, Tank, Diesel, Luna, and Brutus. My pit bulls don't talk, don't do committee meetings, but they know loyalty. And they defend what's ours with a ferocity no colorful flyer can erase. Jack stepped forward, his eyes blazing with a mix of calm and defiance, and let out a sharp whistle, a slicing sound that tore through the air like a war siren. From the backyard came the response, a thunderous chorus of barks, followed by the pounding of paws against dry earth. The 5 pit bulls emerged like a force of nature, a muscle and teeth avalanche that made the ground tremble and the campers swallow hard. Roxy, the black leader with piercing eyes that seemed to stare straight into the soul, bolted ahead, stopping inches from Susan. Her deep bark echoed like a warning drum, and she stood firm, ears perked, glaring at the woman as if to say, "Try ignoring me now." Behind her, Tank, the massive brindle who looked more like a bull than a dog, sniffed Greg's cooler with a low growl that made the plastic tremble. Greg jumped back, nearly spilling his beer, eyes wide like he'd just seen a dinosaur. Diesel and Luna, agile and alert, flanked the fence like sentinels, running precise circles, their bodies tense and ready for the slightest wrong move. Brutus, the most loyal of them all, stood beside Jack, his muscles gleaming under the sun, a silent guardian waiting for nothing more than a gesture from his master to spring into action. The crowd backed away in shock, a sea of pale faces and open mouths. Linda, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind, grabbed Tom's arm and stammered, Do they bite? Oh God, do they bite?" Tom, already pulling her behind him like a human shield, growled, "Better not find out." Jack, arms still crossed, gave a cold stare and replied, "Calm as someone talking about the weather. They only bite if I tell them to. They're here to protect my land from invaders, not to play tag with scouts." His voice was a strand of steel, firm and non-negotiable. Susan, red with rage, took a step forward, almost tripping over Roxy, and shouted, "You've lost your mind, Jack. Setting dangerous dogs on innocent families. This is insanity." Her tone was pure theatre, like she could flip the narrative with one dramatic accusation. Jack tilted his head, a bitter smile curling his lips. "Innocent? You trespassed on my land without permission, set up this circus without even telling me. My dogs are within their rights. You're the one out of line." He pointed to the fence, to the invisible property records that screamed the truth. That land was his, and no amount of votes or shouting was going to change that. Greg, already panicking, raised his hands like he was surrendering. "Look, I don't want trouble. My daughter's in the car crying because of the noise, and now these pit bulls. I'm leaving, Susan. You deal with this." He turned and bolted for the car like the dogs were about to bite his tires. Susan, desperate to hold on to control slipping through her fingers, pointed at Jack and fired back. "It's a bluff. These dogs are trained. They won't attack anyone. You're just trying to scare us." But her voice shook at the end, and her eyes darted between the pit bulls, betraying her bravado. Jack raised an eyebrow and gave a short command. "Roxy, sit." Immediately, the black dog lowered her rear to the ground, obedient as a soldier, but never took her eyes off Susan. Her low growl continued, a rumble in her chest that said she was under orders, but not pleased about the intruder. The crowd went silent, the air heavy with tension and muffled barking. Tom rubbed his forehead and muttered, "No one said anything about dogs in this story. I want out before this turns into a disaster." He pulled Linda again, already fishing for his keys while the other campers exchanged nervous glances, some laughing out of sheer discomfort, others backing away slowly like the pit bulls might explode at any second. Jack stood firm, solid as a rock, his 5 aces at his side, ready to play the final card if Susan dared challenge the sound of reason. The pit bulls changed the game in the blink of an eye. Susan tried to hold the reins with tooth and nail, barking out orders like a captain on a sinking ship, but panic had already taken over, a wave of chaos she could no longer control. My land wasn't the sunny playground she'd imagined, with smiling yogis and scouts singing around a campfire. It was a battlefield now, and she was about to find that out the hard way. Jack stayed on the porch, arms crossed, watching the circus collapse with a cold satisfaction in his eyes. Susan, hair disheveled and voice hoarse from shouting, raised her arms like a mad prophet. "Stay, everyone! This is a community event. Jack can't just throw us out." But her words were lost to the wind as Tom and Linda's son, a scrawny kid around 10, slipped in a puddle of mud mixed with manure and landed hard on his rear. With a sharp scream, "It stinks! I want to go home," he cried, wiping his filthy hands on his pants as tears carved through the grime on his face. Linda, already at her limit, spun toward Susan with fire in her eyes. "Where are the bathrooms, Susan? You promised an organized retreat, not this filthy pasture. My kid is covered in crap." Susan, trying to keep up appearances, shrugged with a forced smile. "It's a rustic retreat, Linda. Use the stream. It's natural, it's charming." But the charm evaporated the moment Tom exploded, the vein on his forehead pulsing like it might burst. "Rustic? This place is a nightmare. Mud, thorns, growling pit bulls. I want my money back, now." He pointed to the ground, where the tall grass hid God knows what, as Roxy gave a short bark, as if agreeing with the review. On the other side, Diane, still clinging to her tablet like a life raft, tried to set up a tent to prove the plan was still on. But fate had other ideas. She plunged her hand into a hidden wasp nest in the ground, and the furious buzzing exploded into the air. "Susan, do something!" she screamed, dropping the tent and running in frantic circles, flailing her arms as the wasps chased her like an attack squad. Greg, now limping from a thorn stuck in his foot, cursed loudly. "Son of a—" Sign threw his hands up. "I'm done." He grabbed the dripping cooler and hobbled to the car, his face red with rage and pain. Phil, the eternal sidekick, tried to help Susan, but the universe just wasn't on his side. He slipped on the same foul-smelling mud that had taken down the kid earlier, landing face first with a pathetic groan. The tablet flew from his hands, landing in a puddle with a sad little splash, while Susan yelled, "Get up, Phil! Go get firewood!" He crawled up, covered in grime, mumbling something about life insurance as he tried to regain his balance. Susan, in one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation, clapped her hands and announced, "Let's roast marshmallows, people. That'll calm everyone down." As if a sticky sweet could erase the stench of manure, the buzzing of wasps and the growls of pit bulls, Jack stepped forward, his voice slicing through the chaos like a blade. "Fun's over, Susan. Get off my land now. No negotiations." He whistled again, and Roxy barked once more, a deep, thunderous sound that froze the campers in place. Tank growled low, baring his teeth, while Diesel and Luna patrolled the fence line, their eyes gleaming with a vibe that said, "Go ahead. Make our day." Panic turned into action. Tents were yanked from the ground, backpacks slung over shoulders, and people ran for their cars like the pit bulls were about to open a portal to hell. Greg, already at the car door, turned to Susan and jabbed a finger at her. "You're crazy, lady. Those pit bulls were the last straw. I'm out. For good." Tom dragged Linda and their crying kid to the car, grumbling about the worst day of his life, while Diane gave up on the tent and chased after Phil, who was still digging through the mud looking for the tablet. Susan was left standing alone in the middle of the chaos, screaming to no one, "You'll all regret abandoning this." But the roar of engines and barking of dogs drowned her out. Jack stood on the porch, Brutus by his side, watching the retreat, with a half-smile. The land was his, and the invaders had finally learned what happens when you mess with a man and his 5 aces. I knew Susan wouldn't give up that easily. She had that stubborn sparkle in her eyes, like a mule that wouldn't let go of a bone even if the sky was falling. But the pit bulls had flipped the script, turned her little retreat into a full-blown circus fire, and I could already taste victory. When the sirens pierced the air, a sharp, authoritative sound that even shut the birds up, I was already smiling. The law was about to finish what my dogs had started, and I couldn't wait to see her face. The rumble of squad cars echoed down the dirt road, kicking up dust as 2 patrol vehicles pulled up with military precision near Jack's fence. The doors opened, and out stepped the officers. Officer Daniels, a grizzled veteran with the face of someone who'd seen everything, and Officer Lopez, younger but with sharp eyes that scanned the scene before even saying a word. Susan wasted no time. She ran up to them like a movie victim, pointing a trembling, outraged finger at Jack. "He set dangerous pit bulls loose on innocent families. That's a crime. You have to do something." Her voice jumped an octave, nearly hysterical, but the officers didn't even flinch. Daniels scratched his chin, badge glinting in the sun, and turned to the crowd. "Who called about trespassers?" Jack calmly raised his hand like he was asking for the check at a diner. I did. These folks here trespassed on my land. Over 80 people, no permission, no notice, nothing. He pulled a worn leather folder from his back pocket and handed over some papers like he'd been waiting for this moment. Here's the land deed. Registered since '68, and licenses for all my pit bulls, everything in order. The documents were yellowed but flawless, sealed and signed with all the weight of legitimacy. Susan crossed her arms, her face as red as a beet. Pinewood Estates approved the retreat. It was voted on, planned. It's a community event. Jack's just being selfish, kicking everyone out because of his pride. She flailed her arms like drama could bend reality. Officer Lopez took the documents, inspecting them line by line with a flashlight, even though it was broad daylight. After a few seconds, he looked at Susan and let out a short sigh. This is private land, Mum. It's outside the Pinewood Committee's jurisdiction. No approval changes that. She didn't back down, of course, but we planned for months. Scouts, yoga groups, neighborhood bonding activities. He should compromise for the good of the community. Her voice trembled with frustration, but Daniels cut her off with a firm look. Are the pit bulls legal? Jack nodded, pointing to the dogs now lounging near the porch, still alert but quiet. They're all rescues, registered as protection dogs. Got training certificates and vaccine records too. Never hurt anyone. They just scare off the folks who shouldn't be here. Lopez stowed the flashlight and crossed his arms. His voice hit like a hammer. You've got 15 minutes to leave. After that, it's a fine for trespassing, and I won't be repeating myself. He glanced at the campers, who were already moving like frantic ants, tearing down crooked tents and stuffing backpacks into cars. The occasional bark from Roxy or Tank echoed like a ticking clock, while Brutus stood beside Jack like a silent sentinel, eyes saying, "Try me." For the first time, Susan had no words. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The campers didn't need more convincing, the zippers zipping, metal clanging as stakes were yanked and shouts of "Let's go!" filled the air. Linda dragged her mud-covered son to the car. Tom cursed under his breath about wasted time, and Greg limped with the cooler, throwing one last furious glare at Susan. Diane and Phil, covered in mud and wasp stings, stumbled. Behind the group, the tablet lost forever in the chaos. Jack stood on the porch, folder back in his pocket, his grin wider now. The sirens had sealed the retreat's fate, and the pit bulls. They were the final shove Susan never saw coming. As the cars vanished down the road, leaving only dust and silence behind, Jack gave Brutus a pat on the head. The law had spoken, but the dogs had roared louder. No one would forget that anytime soon. Susan doesn't bluff when she's angry. I'd seen that look before, a mix of venom and determination that promised trouble. I knew she'd try something dirty, some last card up her sleeve to flip. The game. But I wasn't about to let her even dream of winning this war. My land and my pit bulls weren't giving up an inch, and I'd make sure she felt that in her bones. Jack rubbed his hands together, his face set with a rock-solid resolve, and got to work. First, he installed security cameras all over the property, climbing wobbly ladders and adjusting the angles with the precision of a hunter setting traps. One on the porch covered the entrance, another on the west fence caught the road path, and a third kept watch over the backyard where the pit bulls loved digging holes. He tested each one, glancing at his phone screen, while Brutus barked at the sound of the drill as if approving the reinforcement. Then he moved on to the fences. Extra rolls of barbed wire were unrolled, the metal gleaming like sharp teeth under the sun, and he hammered each stake in place with force, imagining Susan's smug little smile fading when she saw the result. At night, he brought the pit bulls out to the yard, whistling short commands while the moon cast shadows on the ground. Roxy led the pack, her eyes glowing like headlights. Tank trotted like the tank he was. Diesel and Luna flanked the sides, and Brutus took the rear, always the loyal guardian. Jack tossed bits of jerky as rewards, training them to patrol in shifts, a chorus of low growls saying, "No one gets in here." He knew Susan might try something under the cover of darkness, but his 5 aces were ready to strike back. Days later, the mailman delivered a surprise, an official letter from the county stamped in red, full of pompous words like public safety hazard and misuse of property. They claimed the pit bulls were a threat and that the land couldn't be obstructed like that. Jack read it out loud on the porch, laughing so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. "Susan, you desperate snake," he muttered, tossing the paper onto the table like a bad flyer. It was her move, of course, a cheap shot at using bureaucracy to hit where the campers had failed. He wasted no time. He went straight to the makeshift office in his living room, a table covered in coffee ring stains, and got everything in order. The land deed, yellowed but irrefutable, the pit bull's licenses, stamped by the vet, and the footage from the cameras, crystal clear images of the invasion, with Susan screaming and the campers stumbling through the mud. It was a legal arsenal, and he knew he could crush any hearing or courtroom she tried to drag him into. Sitting there, surrounded by paperwork and the distant bark of Diesel, Jack let his mind wander. He thought of Roxy, rescued from a filthy dogfight, the scars on her snout telling a story she'd never forget. Tank, abandoned on a roadside, starving and flea-ridden, now a colossus who purred like a tractor when Jack scratched behind his ears. Diesel and Luna, pulled from an overcrowded kennel, and Brutus, the stray who showed up on his porch during a storm and never left. They were more than dogs. They were family. Warriors he had sworn to protect. He stood up, stepped onto the porch, and looked out toward the horizon, the sun setting behind the trees. "No one's taking this from us," he vowed, voice firm like the fence posts. The pit bulls answered from the yard, Roxy with her deep bark, Tank with his guttural growl, Diesel and Luna in sync, and Brutus with a sharp howl that sealed the pact. Susan could bring letters, lawyers, even an army of committees, but Jack and his 5 aces were ready. That land was theirs. And anything that came their way would have to get through a wall of wire cameras and sharp teeth to prove otherwise. Susan took the fight to the county, thinking she could beat me with red tape. Like stamped papers and musty meeting rooms were enough to bring me to my knees. But I had the truth, and the pit bulls, on my side. A combo she never saw coming. She didn't count on me fighting, with teeth, claws, and a file full of evidence she couldn't ignore. Jack adjusted his worn-out shirt, grabbed the leather folder that had become an extension of his arm, and marched to the county office with the calm confidence of someone who knew the game was already won. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and dusty paperwork. Susan was already there, standing like a dethroned queen, chin raised and voice sharp. "His pit bulls are a public danger." She fired at Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged clerk with crooked glasses and the face of a man who'd rather be fishing. Jack threatened the whole community, let those monsters loose on innocent families. He refuses to cooperate. He never has. She gestured like she was on stage, trying to paint Jack as the villain in a bad movie. Jack stood silent, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, just waiting for his turn. Thompson drummed his fingers on the desk, glancing between Susan and the stack of papers in front of him. "All right, Mrs. Susan, let's hear the other side." Jack stepped forward, opened the folder with a snap, and began laying out the arsenal. "Here's the deed to my land, registered since '68. Here, the licenses for my pit bulls, all rescued, vaccinated, trained. And this," he pushed a flash, drive across the table, "contains footage of the invasion she orchestrated. Over 80 people on my property without permission. The police report is in there too, signed by Officers Daniels and Lopez." Each item landed like a domino, toppling Susan's tower of lies. Of course, she didn't back down. She crossed her arms, flicked her hair, her voice rising. "He's a threat, Mr. Thompson. Pinewood Estates deserves to use that space for the common good. It was voted on, planned. It's the community's right." But her argument rang hollow, like a balloon hissing out air. Thompson skimmed the documents, watched part of the video on his screen. The image of Susan yelling at the campers while Roxy barked was unmistakable. He scratched his forehead, pushed his glasses up, and finally spoke, voice dry and firm. "Look, Miss Susan, your complaint has no legal basis. The land is his, the pit bulls are registered and within the law. I see nothing here that supports your claims." Susan turned, red, her face twisting in fury. But Thompson wasn't done. "And another thing. Filing false complaints can lead to legal consequences for you. Be careful what you allege." The warning landed like thunder. For the first time she was speechless, lips pressed into a tight line. She stared at Jack with hatred sharp enough to melt steel, but she had no more cards to play. With a dramatic spin, she slammed the door behind her, the sound echoing down the hallway like a final cry of defeat. Jack grabbed his folder, its weight now lighter, and stepped out of the office with a lifted chest. The sun hit his face, and the fresh air carried the scent of damp earth. He'd won another battle against Susan's blind stubbornness, and it felt good, like that first cold sip of beer on a hot day. But as he walked toward his pickup, he knew she wasn't done. Susan was like a weed. Chop one head off, another one sprouts. He gave a half smile, thinking of the pit bulls. Waiting at home, Roxy watching the fence, Tank ready to rumble, Diesel and Luna on patrol, Brutus always by his side. She could try again, as many times as she wanted. He and his 5 aces were always ready. And this was a war she'd never win.